and welcome back to the Book and Life podcast. Today we're going to have a brand new book guest on. Whether they're an author, an editor, a producer, you'll never quite know, so you're in for one hell of a ride. But today I just have to do the adverts and then I'll get us straight into that most important conversation. And as we do every week, I'm going to read The Shadow, which is part of the Time Guardian series, and this is book 4 from Marianne Curley. The battle is over, the war is won. The prophecy complete, but life can't just pick up where it left off for Ethan, struggling to cope with tragic loss. At odds with friends in the guard, he finds himself adrift, jumping in shadows and sensing someone who can't possibly be there. Blaming herself for the goddess Athena's death, Giselle swears revenge to vilify the immortals' plan for world domination. But Giselle hadn't planned on love, and that leaves her with an unbearable choice. Should she follow her heart or the strings of a goddess short on praise but high on expectation, who continues to pull her from the grave? As the guard and the order battle through the past and into an impossible future, darkness lurks round every corner. The fight for the world's survival rests with just one. Is it friend or foe who stands in the shadow? And just a reminder that The Price of Freedom by Rosemary Rowan, is being donated to the Ukraine refugee crisis. And here's the blurb for her book. It's one of her Roman British crime series, which was written under her maiden name. All editions can be found online where all books are sold, even her agents donating her commission. Sorry, I don't have the blurb for that, but that's what she's doing. And now, without further ado, let's get you to the guests. And welcome back to the Book and Life podcast, guys. We are extremely lucky because today we are going to be hosting an incredible author from the ECW Press. I am delighted that Claire was able to get her on, and I'm delighted that we overcame all these technical issues to be able to bring her to you today. So without further ado, everyone, please welcome Lesley.
Hi there.
So, Lesley, tell us about your book and what it means to you.
Well, it means a lot. It's a novel called Far Creek Road. It's actually set in a suburb of Vancouver on the west coast of Canada, where I grew up with, by the way, on my mother's side, they're Scottish. So there were a lot of Scottish accents that didn't make it into the book. When I write a book, place is very important to me. So my home place is very important. And that's what first brought the book to me, writing about this suburb at the time of the Cold War, of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's something I don't really remember. I was alive, but I was a bit young. But it's the story of a little girl in the suburb named Mary Alice, although she's called Tink because she's tiny, and her very much older sister has called her after Tinkerbell and Peter Pan. She makes a friend who moves into the suburb, a little boy named Norman, and it turns out, it's widely rumored at first, but it seems true that his parents are left-wing. Nobody knows quite how much, but as the Cuban Missile Crisis starts looming in 1962, there are rumors that they're communists. And this overturns everything. Little Tink is very nosy. So she follows people around. She listens. She often doesn't know what she hears. She doesn't realize that when two parents are sitting together in a car with their arms around each other, they aren't just making each other feel better about things that are going on. But obviously, as adults, we kind of get what's going on. She's writing it as an adult. So it's the story of a little girl in a traumatic time who learns that the world is a lot more complicated than she first thought.
Yeah, it's an amazing story, and it's a story that affected so many people, especially in
Yeah.
that time period as well. And I suppose there would almost be kind of like a question of them being, because they come from Scotland or they came from somewhere else. There might have been that question as well of, well, they're not native to here, so maybe they were curious about that too. You think?
In this book, everybody comes from somewhere else in this suburb. They're all from some sort of European background by and large, except that it's right on the edge of an indigenous reservation, the native Capilano people from the Musqueam Nation.
Oh wow.
They're all Scottish or Irish, or a few outliers are Polish, whose families first moved to the prairies and were farmers there. But it was originally a very white middle class place of people who were second and third generation immigrants, maybe to Canada. That's changed, actually. The suburb that it's based on is heavily Iranian right now.
Oh
Um,
wow.
just
So it's
because,
kind of,
well, this is Canada and people move in and they move with their friends, right?
yeah, I was gonna say, and it's good that it's sort of staying that kind of, you know, the change of culture is still sort of there all the time as well. It kind of almost adds to the suburb's history.
It's vibrant. At the time the book is set, it was pretty white bread, aside from the indigenous, that people in Europe tend to say Indian reservation, but people don't like that anymore. They prefer indigenous.
Yeah,
So it was when I myself was growing up a few years after this. I actually remember when the first Chinese Canadian girl came into my class when I was already about 12 or 13, and then things changed. And so
yeah,
now it's very multicultural and vibrant, but at the time it was a very conformist place and very white breadish and old fashioned. But also, the fathers had fought in the Second World War for Canada. And so there
yeah.
was an underlying trauma going on there.
Yeah, I was gonna say that sometimes there is that kind of underlying trauma of previous wars or past sort of historical events that kind of make people more agitated when things like these kind of topics come up, or at least suspected. And I think that's where a lot of the fear comes from, especially nowadays. You get that sense of fear still existing even today. So
Well,
what
I
was
think, sorry,
oh
I was
sorry.
going to say at the time, what a lot of these people, the men who had fought in the Canadian Army and the women whose brothers, fathers, boyfriends had been overseas at risk of death every single day, they figured they had earned their security.
Yeah,
They wanted to come home. They wanted to have a house, have a family, and have no problems whatsoever.
yeah,
But of course, where is there a life where you don't have any problems whatsoever?
there is no such thing. No such thing. So, what was your moment that you kind of clicked that this was a story that you had to write?
Um, you know, I I write somewhat differently from a lot of people, a lot of my friends. I mean, it's all fun to talk about. For me, when I start to have a glimmer of an idea, it can be years before I actually write the book. I can just write it down, like many writers. I have a journal I write in constantly. I can say, oh, I have this idea of this thing, and maybe I'll look at it a year later and think, well, that was awful, you know, and
We all
and
know
that
that. Yep.
and so I never do anything with it. But at a certain point, an idea starts to feel as if it may turn into something, and I tend to open a notebook and start scrawling in it. Um, and one of the things that helps me, two of the things that helps me, one is when a title pops into my head.
Yeah.
And when the title Far Creek Road popped into my head, I knew I had the book. And what often happens in those notebooks is once I get the opening line, which in this case is, I wish I had some of that furniture my father made for our house on Far Creek Road. Um,
Oh,
Somehow that's a voice, isn't it?
yes.
Um, so when I have a title and a voice, I can get going, and it's extremely peeving to me in the years that I keep these notebooks if somebody else publishes a book with the same title.
Yeah, I've been there, and you've got to think of a new one, or you got to change it up, and yeah, yeah, because there's always the original title to you as well. Yeah.
And it actually sets me back quite a lot, even though one of the titles, I remember it was published when I was just about to start writing something a few years ago, and another book with the same title came out, and I thought, oh, I can't do this now. And it took a while to get around to doing it. So
Yeah, I mean,
um,
I think that happens to the best of us. Or
yeah.
you see an idea that's similar to what you were writing or you were working on, and then you're like, "Eesh, should I continue this or should I shelf it?" You know, it's always that kind of the
Yeah.
way. Uh, an actually funny story on that is I wrote a book and I had no idea there was an idea similar to mine, and the
Oh,
publisher had,
painful.
and I sent the book and they said we love it, but we already got a book with
Oh
a similar
no.
idea. We can't take it. And I was crushed. I really, really was. And I had no idea. I hadn't even heard of the book being released or published or
Oh
anything. And
no.
yeah, so I mean, I think as authors, we all kind of go through that. And I think
Yeah.
that sometimes the upside to agents is that they're a little bit more clued in than we are and can sometimes guide us away from those pitfalls.
Sometimes, but sometimes people are very, very quiet about what they're working on. I've been a writer for a long time, and so I have a lot of writer friends, and it's sort of, oh, what are you working on? A book. And there's there's
I can
not a lot of
imagine.
sharing going on there. So I actually, I have a website where I've been writing book reviews lately because there's so much of a decline, certainly in Canada, of book reviewing. So it's something I've started doing more of. And one of the things I'm going to do soon is that a friend of mine, a writer, published a novel about 20 years ago called Semi Detached. And lo and behold, one was published last fall called Semi Detached by another friend of mine and these were two different friend groups, right? They didn't know one another. And in fact, the publishers and agents didn't care if another book had come out 20 years before with the same title. It was one of my other friend's first books. So I'm actually going to write a review of two books with the same title, both of which are set in Toronto, and see what happens to two books about the same place and with, something in common after a 20-year gap. I think that should be fun.
That should definitely be fun. And it's funny you say that about reviewing because I've noticed, especially in the sort of the UK, that's also happening. Like
Is it?
there's such a decline in
Oh,
reviews. I mean, a lot of what you see now is like booktubers who are people that record their book reviews and post them on Twitter or post them on YouTube or
mm,
TikTok and things like that. But I miss Goodreads. I miss going on Goodreads and seeing what's been the most reviewed or what's the most talked about or having a group of fans come and tell me you gotta read this or this.
yeah.
That's the upside, and I think Goodreads was a really good way of doing that and promoting and not just for your own stuff, but sharing really good material with other people that you think will appreciate it and enjoy it and get something out of it.
Yeah, it's a changing landscape. I have a friend who is a longtime publicist. She's very, very savvy. She's worked for the big houses, Penguin Random House and Harper's, various places. And she says a lot of people she knows are edging out of book publicity at the moment because it's such chaos and they don't know how to promote books. And thank you for inviting me on your podcast, by the way. But she says she's going to stick around just because it's so weird. She wants to see what happens because eventually, presumably, things will settle down somehow. But I don't know how. And she, who's much more experienced than I am, she doesn't know how. Yeah, it's a
I
weird
mean, I
time.
think I think what we're going to see is sort of book promotions sort of taking more into a social media aspect,
Yeah.
because you're starting to see a wave of book podcasts arriving.
Yes.
It's not just about promoting audiobooks or having little episodic podcasts that come from a book. It's actually more about talking about books and talking about fun of having books and
Yes.
having these discussions and things like that. And it's actually a segment that I'm hoping to start in the new sort of the summer, is having friends on to talk about books that they've read. You know,
Yes.
just
Good
everyday
idea.
people with everyday jobs who have maybe read a book and they want to discuss it, and we, you know, maybe I've read it too, and we talk about it and we do that kind of thing. And I think that might be a step forward in the promotion of books and in the publicity side of things. But I also
Well,
think it needs to tie into the stores as well.
and I mean, and then you count on friends. So my sister-in-law just emailed me today because she was copying something. One of her neighbors had seen my book in my brother and sister-in-law's house, and she said, "Oh, what's that?" And she went out and got it, and she loved it. So it's just that sort of you know, word of mouth that's doing things. So this woman, whom I've never met, I got a nice email from her via my sister-in-law, and she's going to tell. I said, "Tell other people, for heaven's sakes, if you like it, because that seems to be the way it works at the moment." And podcasts, and I've had a website forever, and I'm going to do a newsletter fairly soon. I'm just gearing up to get that out there because my website is actually quite popular, so I'll try and expand it a bit and shove some stuff out there too.
Yeah, and I mean that's the things that I've kind of learned. I've been doing this probably 10 years, well, 14 years,
Yeah.
and I've seen it change. Like one time we would all be using Twitter, next time we were all, you know, having Facebook review groups, and we were in book clubs, and we were doing blog hops and
Yeah.
all this other stuff. And that, you know, people don't read blogs anymore. They want to
Yeah.
see things on Instagram. They want to see things on TikTok because it's instant gratification. And that's, and sadly, where we are nowadays. People tend to get distracted by their phones more than they're picking up a book or, you know, reading a magazine in the doctor's office. It's a completely different change to how things are being done. And I
And
think,
it is. And
go
it's
ahead.
interesting because a friend of mine teaches in a master's program, and they were just doing the units with um, basically on how to market the manuscripts that the students have been producing. And so they had in on social media, on Zoom and everything, a lot of guests from the publishing industry who
Yeah,
were saying the one thing that they see lately, um, that's making it difficult as well, is that how quickly things do, the cycle is very, very fast now, how things
yeah,
surface and then fall away. So book talk is the current big thing, but they're already seeing numbers dropping off there. So everything cycles through much more quickly. I mean, it's to do a lot with our attention spans, because as you say, we're on the phone in the doctor's office instead of reading the old copy of National Geographic. I don't know if that's the case there. That
yeah.
used to be what.
I've seen it. It's,
Hmm?
you know, I go to the hospital frequently for my arthritis, and I'm the only one sitting in there with a book most of the time. Everybody else is on their phones or,
Yeah.
you know, things like that. And it was funny because my doctor's, you know, he's getting on in age, and he said I'm one of the few patients that he ever sees walking in the door with a book in her hand, you know,
Yeah.
or something along those lines. And he's always curious to see what I'm reading. He doesn't like anything I read, but he's always curious just to see what it is. And I think that's really telling of where we've come to, that, you know, even he expects all his patients to come in with the phone super glued to their hand and be Googling their symptoms and stuff like that. And you know, it's that we're at that point where, you know, we're going through the phase of technology, and I'm sure that it'll wrap round again, and books will come back up and be something that everybody talks about, especially with the rise of audiobooks and things like that people can listen to in the car, because I've noticed a lot of people don't listen to radio anymore. That's a thing now too. So yeah, and I think embracing things like using TikTok and learning how to maybe post snippets of books and things like that of your books or of books you're reading to people out there is another good way of just keeping sort of the book kind of thing in front of everybody and getting that momentum.
It's interesting. I was just, Toronto has a subway system. I'm from Vancouver on the west coast of Canada, but I live in Toronto. We have a subway system, and I was just there the other day making a longish trip, and the first thing I saw was a young woman, early 20s, reading, standing waiting for the car, reading a book called from the 50s or 40s called How to Win Friends and Influence People, Norman Vincent Peale, which is just out apparently in a reissue. And speaking of National Geographic, I got on the subway and there was a young man, like young guy, looked studenty looking, reading a National Geographic. And I thought, oh, this is very odd, because those are books that would have been things that would have been old when I was a kid.
Yeah.
But they're surfacing, and I always look around the subway and buses and streetcars here and see what people are reading, and it's kind of interesting because a lot of them aren't current, but because you can pick up older books in libraries, and I think part of it is economic. People can't afford as many books as they used to.
Yeah, I would
That
agree because books have become so expensive as
they
well.
have.
Yeah.
I've been having a very odd thing happen. My previous book is sort of a mashup sci-fi historical novel romance sort of thing called Time Squared, with time travel in it. And, it did fine when it came out, but first of all, it was pirated by a sci-fi website. And second of all,
Yeah, that happens.
yeah, and second of all, it's been picked up by the Libby library thing, and it's getting both the audiobook and the ebook are getting thousands of downloads for when did it come out? 2021. They're
Yeah.
piling on, and on Goodreads. Speaking of Goodreads, there are a couple of thousand reviews, ratings and reviews for a book that I published going on 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of odd. In that case, it's very odd because most of these have been in the U.S. and a lot of the people don't like it. It's not
Yeah.
what they were expecting. So, but other people really like it. It's started to show up in British and I presume Scottish libraries, and for some reason in Pakistani libraries, it's had a little. So these things go on. They develop lives of their own, and they're quite unpredictable. I mean, a lot of people do like the book, but it's interesting. There are trolls that you start getting when they
Yeah.
do show
We
up
all
on
get one.
online sites. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been there. I had the similar thing. I had a YA come out and it had over 50,000 downloads on a pirate site
Mm.
and only sold 10 copies. And I was
Yeah.
like, "What?" And the same thing, like I had trolls that attacked it the second that it was on Goodreads, I thought, "Wow, this is insane." And I actually make a point in not looking at reviews for my own books on Goodreads because I know there's a good chance that there's a bunch of trolls out there that's going to just squash it. And I think that's another thing. A lot of authors are so scared to interact now with some readers because we never know, what's going to happen or what it turns into.
Yeah.
And I think that's all things that we kind of have to consider moving forward as well. So, can
It
you tell
is.
us about your journey from a writer to an author? What was that like for you to make that adjustment?
I don't know what you use those terms differently than me, because writer and author to me are interchangeable terms. So do you mean from somebody who was writing to someone who was publishing?
Yes, yes,
Okay. Um, uh, well, I was a person who wanted to write all my life. I was an obnoxious little child who said, I'm going to be a writer when I grow up, to the point where my parents got me a toy typewriter when I was about 7. Um, so I'd always written. I started my first truly dreadful novel when I was 17 and in university, and finished it when I was 22. And not surprisingly, it was widely rejected.
Yep.
All
Involving
the
there.
characters had deeply symbolic names.
Yeah, yeah, involving there.
So what happened though was that a very, very wonderful editor here in Canada called me into her office and said, "Look, I think you have some talent here, but it's very undisciplined." You know, I had been in a creative writing program at the University of British Columbia, but I dropped out. I really hadn't liked it. I hadn't liked reading such bad writing,
Yep.
my own bad writing primarily. But um, so she said, what you've got to do is you've got to learn how to write a short story, learn the discipline. You would have been taught that in school, but read short stories. And of course, in Canada, we have a brilliant short story writer in Alice Munro. She said, and Margaret Atwood as well. Read every word they've written, read other writers, and then just write. And that is probably what tipped me from being a wannabe into getting published, because although I can't say the first stories I wrote were publishable, I did start writing short stories that got published in small and then bigger magazines, and then I had a short story book out, and then I got my first novel and on from there.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it I the editor's name, I must credit, was named Anna Porter. She worked at a publishing house called McClelland and Stewart. She's now herself a writer. She writes mysteries. So she's
Oh
had a
wow.
very interesting career. Yeah, she's quite wonderful actually.
You always find that sometimes the editor becomes the writer and the writer becomes the editor. It's kind of like a very weird dance that we all do, and I think that's incredible. So what can your readers be looking forward to kind of in the coming year? Is there anything exciting that they can be excited about coming out?
Coming out, not yet. I am working on another novel, set here in Toronto, about a young woman, I guess I can say this much, who grows obsessed with Chekhov.
Oh,
And so I've just been doing some fun things and going, because we've just talked about Canada being a very multicultural country, going to the Russian parts of Toronto, which is very fraught at the moment because there is a war going on, and that's part of it, of
yep.
course. There are also Ukrainian parts of Toronto. um,
Oh, yep, the hotbeds. Yep, we've got the same thing in Glasgow.
you
Mm-hmm.
have, right? Yeah.
Yep.
So it's kind of interesting to just go out there. I have a friend, a very good friend of mine, who worked in film for quite a few years. She's actually a yoga teacher now, but when she worked in film, she was a production designer, which meant she knows all the nooks and crannies of this city, because she would be looking for specific locations where they could shoot a movie. And so she can just, I'm saying, Alicia, I want to find this. And she said, okay, well, we'll go here and have lunch there and do this and walk there and go to this incredibly bizarre spa over there. And so we do a lot of fun things.
Yeah, it sounds amazing.
Yeah.
So you made it through the Book and Life podcast.
Thank you.
Um, it's literally that is the upside to this podcast is it is this short chat between two writers or two authors, and we just talk books and we talk about writing and we talk about the journeys and the different things that people can try to have that dream that we all dreamed of in walking into the store and seeing our names on the shelf and knowing that people are getting love and inspiration from our work. So I cannot thank you enough for coming on today. And I really hope that I get to have you back when your next one comes out and we can talk a little bit more about that and how your explorations went and if you found anywhere that was super cool that you want to share with us.
Oh yeah, I've already gone to a couple. I won't tell you now, but yes, a couple. My friend is just a resource of all sorts of very, very strange places. I can tell you that much.
Well, it will be an honor to have you back. Thank you again for coming on the show. Guys, let's be safe and please remember, give each other time, give each other space, and give each other, most importantly, love, especially in this day and age. And I will see you guys all again next Monday.